My name's Kim Taylor, and I am the Marketing Director for Scarborough International, and honored to be your host today. This is an interactive webinar, and we're here to answer your questions, so please submit any questions you have. You will find a Q&A button on your screen. It's at the top of your screen, and your question will appear to the audience so everybody can see it. I encourage you guys to start asking questions now if you've got any. Also note that you can easily adjust your windows. Just click on the top of the video portion to maximize or minimize this piece of the webinar. So while you're adjusting your screens and posting your questions, I'll take a minute to introduce you to Scarborough. Scarborough is a full-service logistics provider that has been operating since 1984. We are headquartered in the heart of America in Kansas City, where faith, family, and hard work make for a great organization. We also have offices in Chicago, St. Louis, Des Moines, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and Shanghai, China. We also have a sales presence in New York and Dallas. We are part of a global network of partners, which also makes us have offices in every single port of the world. We truly partner with our clients, and we act as an extension to your company, making your job easier. I want to introduce you to Ivory Karamitros. Ivory is the director of the World Trade Center of Kansas City. Ivory's extensive background is in international trade and economic development. It has been key to not only her own success, but we've had a major hand in the success of the World Trade Center of Kansas City. Ivory was on the original team that extensively worked on the application to be involved in the Global Cities Initiative, leaving Kansas City as one of only 28 chosen cities across the nation at the time to work with JP Morgan Chase and Brookings Institution joint project for the Global Cities Initiative, The Exchange. Ivory was the project manager for GCI, led the export plan for KC, and currently manages the Export Concierge program that has come about from the export plan for Kansas City. Awesome. Thank you, Ivory.
No problem. So thank you all so much for joining us here today. I know some of y'all may not be so familiar with the Global Cities Initiative, but it's been very helpful for a lot of cities throughout the U.S., and then now it's gone internationally through a lot of the hard work of our partners at Brookings. But essentially, the GCI is a joint project between Brookings and JP Morgan Chase, and it helps, we work in tandem with those leaders, so we're able to come together and learn how to basically create plans for our economies as we consider the future of our economies and the role of our cities in the global economy. And through Brookings, they're able to connect us to the data and research that's available regarding our cities, and then also on a national level, and then also on an international level. So they've been very helpful with us as we try to have basically create a data-driven solution to the issues that face our different communities in the United States. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you all two fantastic folks, Merrick Gutman, who is with the Brookings Institution. Merrick is a fellow, and he is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Global Engagement at the Brookings Institution in their Metropolitan Policy Program. So they specifically work with cities and help them create solutions for cities on a real-time level. And like I said before, with the data-driven solutions, and so they're able to really help us understand more about what's happening on a local level in our economies. And his work focuses on bridging the think tank perspectives of Brookings, and then also help us then apply that information on a real-time level in our community to help us have a more vibrant city and metropolitan area. Ryan is also on this, Ryan Carroll with the Des Moines Economic Partnership, Greater Des Moines Partnership, excuse me. And he is essentially the counterpart for myself in Des Moines. He led also the application for the GCI in Des Moines, and also is leading the implementation of their export plan that they were able to produce with Brookings, and then also is leading the foreign direct investment plan and that effort in Des Moines as well. So we're so glad to have both of you here. I'm going to give this away to Merrick. He will talk a little bit more in depth about what the GCI is and how it came about with Brookings, and then thank you so much.
So thanks, Ivory. I think what my objective is be to put into context how the macro issues and these activities we've been undertaking nationally and internationally relate right down to the local level and specifically to help firms. And then Ivory and Ryan can come back in and give specific examples of how they are, as economic development leaders, executing on this in order to strengthen the competitiveness and growth opportunities for individual firms within their regional economies. So with that, I'll give a little introduction to the Global Cities Initiative, what motivated it, how it relates in the international trends toward individual businesses, and how economic development leaders are taking action in to support firms and make this business case. Global Cities is fundamentally about strengthening the international economic connections and competitiveness of our metropolitan areas or city regions by focusing in on traded sectors, and that will produce more sustained growth and higher quality jobs. We're doing that through a series of activities, including research on specific drivers of economic competitiveness and how firms can be better positioned to compete internationally. Innovation, which is problem solving with particular places like Kansas City, Des Moines, and an additional 30 plus internationally city regions on solving these problems and performing better. And then exchange, which is replicating these ideas and policies and program solutions so that more places can benefit and help their business community thrive. We started the Global Cities Initiative because of some major international trends that were really impacting locally on firms. One, urbanization. So that was driving the creation of a much broader global middle class and creating demand for business services, goods, and products in a supply chain as well as direct to consumers. Globalization, which I'll mention in a little while, but the international economy is inextricably linked now. Whether you like free trade agreements or don't like free trade agreements, trade is happening and trade will not diminish. It's just the rules that you're acting within. And therefore, globalization is another key factor that everyone in the economy, whether it's local, state, or national, needs to take into account in their strategies. And obviously, firms need to do that as well. And finally, massive disruptive technological change that are shifting the way that firms are innovating, are competing, and the workforce fits into firm growth. We took a look at more than 30 places internationally and in the United States to capture the characteristics of what makes them competitive. Every place from small scale, like upstate South Carolina, Greenville, to Singapore, to London, and characterized 10 different elements of things that a city and region could do to make themselves more effective in helping their companies and their workforce compete in the international marketplace. We also took a look at what are the key drivers for economic competitiveness and assessed across traded sectors, innovation, workforce talent, infrastructure, and governance. That's the research piece of this, and evaluated these different elements and how city regions could act more effectively in order to support this kind of ecosystem for their firms and individual firms, what the implications were. And we learned that there's this old perception of a global city, a standard traditional perception of a New York, Tokyo, Singapore, London, but in reality, any city can be global in its perspective. So it can be a very small community like metropolitan Greenville, Spartanburg, which, as I mentioned before, is focused on these issues and is the highest intensity foreign direct investment in the United States, to a Stockholm or Brisbane versus Sydney, Columbus versus Chicago. So what we did is then apply this to a set of local partners and learned from problem solving with them around how they could use this knowledge to be more effective programmatically, and again, focused on helping their firms to grow and support the local economy. This is a list of all the places that are executing on global cities, trade and investment strategies through a process. You can see it's very diverse in terms of economies, geographies, governmental makeup in the United States and increasingly international. This represents in the US more than 30% of the entire economy. They're now acting with some specificity on global strategies. What that entails specifically in this network has been developing a comprehensive trades plan, which includes exports and foreign direct investments and other elements of infrastructure or advanced industry support, which I mentioned before as key drivers. Also, connecting places to global best practices, so Kansas City and Des Moines can learn from counterparts in San Diego or Toronto or Mexico City, and implementation through that kind of peer interaction, monitoring and promoting success stories, and facilitating specific international relationships where particular city regions can work with other ones where there is a supply chain link, an industry sector or clusteral link, some geographic or workforce links that can benefit from working together to be more competitive. And this element of trade is a key part of a more comprehensive international competitive strategy. So we've seen, again, workforce, infrastructure, utilization of foreign talent, innovation activities, all contributing toward what is a base of exports and FDI as implementation actions by city regions, economic development leads, once more in support of their firms and key industry clusters. So quickly, why does all this matter to firms and to localities? Why are we dealing with this at the local level and the metropolitan level? And what are the examples of actions that have been taken that can be expanded upon by Kansas City and Des Moines? First of all, we looked at where jobs are coming from. And really, most jobs are not being created now from bringing large firms into, attracting large firms for relocation into a community. They're really coming from new establishments, startups, which then the following year are often the biggest losers in jobs, and that sweet spot, which is expansion of existing firms. That's why it's so important to focus in on these strategies around growth of your existing businesses through international opportunities, because that's where job creation is coming from. That's where great competitiveness is coming from for regions. And the reason for looking internationally in traded sectors is because you create one traded sector job that actually spins off 3 locally serving jobs. Depends a little bit on the industry, but that's the general multiplier effect. And so rather than focus in on, we need a new retail outlet here, we're talking about supporting firms that have the potential to trade outside of their regions and outside of the country. These are lots of different categories of firms. So it's not just about moving goods and products, but it's also in energy and services and other categories of activity that can be traded outside of the local economy. The great thing about these jobs is that they pay higher wages, nearly double on average, and that they're also available and support from the economic developer's perspective, lots of different skills. So 50% of these kinds of jobs actually don't require a 4-year degree. Now, realize that we're acting, as I mentioned, in this international economy, and a big statistic that reflects this is that you'll see in 2014, we were about 40% of global GDP coming from cross-border flows of goods, services, and capital. That shows really clearly how integrated our international economies are. And of course, the standard stat, there's a huge market still growing in the United States, but more than 85%, close to 86% is projected for growth between 2015 and 2020 outside of the United States. And more broadly, this growth is happening in different parts of the world, as reflected in this map, to show that the middle class is expanding. So a proportion of the middle class back in 2009 was concentrated in North America and Europe, but by 2030, an enormous percentage of that middle class is going to be located in the Asia Pacific and increasing percentages in South America, Oceania, and even Africa. And that, the slide is complicated because it actually has an animation that doesn't come through for the presentation. But this slide shows that where 75% of all global middle class consumption was concentrated in Europe, Japan, and North America back in 2000, it'll only be 15% by the time we get to 2050. So there's a real market imperative at the macro level for focusing on this issue. Then it gets down to the firms, and I suspect that most of the people watching today are from firms. So what does this mean for business executives who are making choices about where they put their effort? Well, Middle market firms, those firms that generate the most jobs and they're most likely to be expanding in metropolitan economies, actually do better if they are exporting. So you can see that they have higher revenue growth, they add more employees, they project better revenue growth over non-exporting companies in that middle market. It also works for both goods and services. You see that during the heart of the recession, exporting companies were more resilient. They actually grew in revenue by 37%, while non-exporting manufacturing firms decreased in revenue by 7%. And it applies to business services as well, where you have higher sales, higher employment, and actually paying higher wages than non-exporters. So there is a very clear business case for firm success based upon looking internationally. Now, the problem is that we don't do enough of it. And despite 5+ years of focus and conversation about how important this is, we still don't. We don't have enough recurring exporting firms. So a firm that may do a one-off, 2/3 of firms are recurring exports, 1/3 of the firms are not. The other factor is that they're only selling to one market. And it's not a question of how much. There's often only one sale to a market. A Canadian company identifies you on the internet, makes a sale, and that counts as an export. So the work that we did with the National Center for the Middle Market to evaluate how many firms are looking at these issues, how many are participating internationally, shows that we have a real deficit to address. I'll just mention very briefly the flip side of that, which is foreign direct investment. And we see the U.S. is actually capturing less of an increasing market there. That's important to firms because it generates a lot of additional research and development, again, higher wages, connects with knowledge, technology, and networks that help firms to expand internationally. And the point this is that most of these investments in foreign direct investment from FDI are not greenfield, but they're actually mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, equity positions. So the flip side of being global is also you get assets coming in from international investors that really help to expand your companies and oftentimes have an effect that enables access to international markets. Now, why at the metropolitan level? Well, that's where the economy really works. You've got shared assets and networks, whether it's economic development organizations, supply chain, close by supply chains, the relationship with universities, research centers, the infrastructure that ties everybody together, and most important of all, the workforce functions at a metropolitan region scale. So we really need to focus down on this level for action. The firms are facing, as we learned through the Global Cities work with all of these communities, firms are facing some very consistent challenges. And you might see yourselves in this if you're thinking about exporting or you are already exporting and grappling with some of those issues. Firms are unfamiliar with going global and therefore kind of fear it. They lack awareness of these opportunities. They're confused by very fragmented export assistance delivery systems. On this export promotion and support side, they're more reactive than proactive, so generate a lower pipeline of export-ready companies than might be possible if they were more specific and targeted and strategic. And regional leaders tend to have a disincentive to really invest in this effort because the ability to count and take credit for attracting a business and attracting a certain number of jobs is a lot easier to explain and highlight than growing 1, 2, 3, 5 jobs in a firm that exists. So there are some challenges in the system to overcome, and we've been focused on through Global Cities and in these particular markets. Then finally, there are different roles and responsibilities. A lot of people consider trade to be a national question. Well, that's true in terms of setting the groundwork and having an international network of commercial and foreign service offices that cannot be replicated by any individual city. But really at the local level is where your economic development assistance programs can integrate all of these supports from across the locality and at different levels of federal and state. They also have the direct relationships with the firms. And so they are able to identify firms through regular interaction. They understand what the local strategy is for economic growth, where you have the greatest strengths and clusters. So that's why we're emphasizing metropolitan areas the city regions as the leaders on executing around increased exports. And that means all of these different players that have some role in assisting firms to grow and be more global, whether it's the governmental side, but significantly the private sector has taken the primary role through economic development organizations that are public and private, through chambers of commerce, through special organizations, as well as universities and infrastructure. And finally, I'm going to be very brief about this because I think that Kansas City and Des Moines were better positioned to talk about the details of how they're supporting firms. But through Global Cities, we piloted and then refined a particular approach that now the participants and others are following in order to be effective about executing an international business strategy for their regions and positioning to assist firms. There's a market assessment that involved very detailed surveys and hundreds of interviews with local firms in order to identify what the needs were, how they were already interacting, and what the support system should look like in order to assist them better and to focus on particular opportunities by industry cluster or characteristics of the local firms and the economic environment. Then there was an actual business plan with specific goals, strategies, tactics, and measures to hold people accountable. So each place identified what their unique position would be, and then what their firm characteristics were, and tailored their activities and new supports or refinement of existing supports to those firms and that local marketplace. Then they made operational assignments and commitments, again, to hold everyone accountable for delivering this. This is not a high-level strategy. It is a very tactical, implementation-oriented effort, and created some policy memos in order to identify what they needed in order to execute beyond what existing resources were. All these different markets focused on different specializations. So what their biggest offer was to the international marketplace, but they also focused beyond these specializations on what their individual firms need and came up with a lot of different activities around exports and foreign direct investment, how they could integrate it more effectively into mainstream economic development, the kinds of changes to be more customer-driven versus oriented toward what service providers want to measure themselves on, new mentoring relationships between firms, large and small, assistance with trade missions and supply chain entry in that way, what are the roles of universities, culture change, new grant competitions, inspiring new potential exporters to think about this, and how do they project their global identity into the international marketplace most effectively. Lots of different examples of functional coordination, industry sector-based coordination, how to tailor support for firms, whether they were new to export versus new to markets, infrastructure investments like connecting port to facility through a new road, linkages between what higher ed could do for small, medium-sized enterprises, campaigns and integrating assistance through an export portal or better case management. Many different examples, including place-to-place collaborations around particular industry sectors in which there are strengths, and a whole set of issues and opportunities identified to go forward, just depending again on what the local characteristics look like. So I will stop there and turn it over to the actual practitioners who are implementing these strategies. And I'm happy to take questions about what's happening in other markets after they talk a little bit about what's happening in Des Moines and Kansas City specifically. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Merrick, so much. I think we'll turn it over to Ryan right now and figure out why exactly Des Moines applied for GCI, where you're at in the process, some major takeaways. Let's just hear what you have to say.
Very good. Well, thanks, Kim, and thank you, Merrick, for a great presentation on the background of this outstanding program. Des Moines actually decided to get involved in this a few years ago, and really we did a regional strategic plan from an economic development perspective for our area. And one of the things that was identified in that plan was that we were really lacking in our global connectivity issues. So we essentially looked at this as a three-legged stool. We wanted to increase our exports, increase our foreign direct investment, and then also attract more international talent to our marketplace. And as fate would have it, the GCI program really came to light at right about the same time that we were going to begin implementation of that other plan. And so for that reason, we applied and were accepted into the program. And really, to kind of back up, why was Des Moines thinking about trying to become more global? We've had a lot of good wins and a lot of good successes here over the last few years from an economic development perspective. And we really realized that there's a limitation to that, and it was really driven by a lot of things that we were doing domestically, and we weren't really engaged enough on the global stage to sustain the growth and success that we're having over time. So it really kind of goes back to the comments that Merrick made about competitiveness, maintaining that, and helping to grow our region, not only now, but certainly into the future. And then as we kind of got into the program, we became aware of some of the stats Merrick used about 95% of the world's customers are outside of the U.S. and how important it is for global engagement. So with that, in terms of where we are in our process right now, we are actively engaged in a lot of the things that Merrick pointed to. I would say the most important of those is our BRE, or our Business Retention and Expansion Program. And that is really just continuing to interact with our existing businesses. And we have essentially globalized that program. Prior to our going through the GCI, we were frankly not asking our existing firms any questions from an economic development standpoint about any issues they were potentially having with trade, how much exporting they were doing, job creation as a result of that. And then on the foreign direct investment side, we learned a great deal in going through the interview process when we went through that part of our plan, how important competitiveness is globally to those firms that we have here in our marketplace. And what we really learned is it's not about the economic development incentives that we have that are available through our states and through our communities. It's that ability to help the local firm here become more competitive in trying to get funds from the parent company, as they could be in competition with other locations throughout the U.S. and throughout the world to get that continued investment. So we really looked at that closely and are trying to help those firms solve those issues. And for us, one of the biggest areas that we're really trying to work on is that talent issue. And I know a lot of cities are faced with that same challenge. Ours is perhaps a little bit different than some larger cities, in that in our case, it's not about finding people and training them. It's just about trying to get more folks into our marketplace. We've got a low unemployment rate here, and we're hearing from our global firms that that's a challenge in terms of trying to attract more investment to our marketplace. So those two areas are certainly off and running for us. And then we've also, and we talked about creating some of these initiatives prior to our involvement in the GCI, but once we got involved in that process, it became extremely clear just how global these initiatives are, and they've really become a major part of the backbone of our strategy moving forward. And the first of those is we created an economic development corridor with Ames, which is a community that's just to the north of us, where Iowa State University is located. And we named that initiative the Cultivation Corridor, and it's focused specifically on positioning Central Iowa as an agriculture and bioscience world leader. So taking all the assets we have that are offered through Iowa State University, as well as our existing business climate here, and really elevating that domestically and internationally is really sort of the backbone of what we're doing. Another area that we are pretty strong in Greater Des Moines is insurance and financial services, which that was also on one of Merrick's slides, and a couple other programs that came out of that area, one of which was we established a global insurance symposium, which we host annually here in Des Moines, and we attract insurance executives from around the globe to our marketplace. We've got over 81 insurance companies headquartered in our market here, and the symposium is multiple days, and it really covers a lot of the issues and regulations and other things that insurance companies face, cybersecurity, software, different kinds of things. that industry is looking at and trying to plan for in the future. And as kind of an offshoot of that, we created a global insurance accelerator. And that is funded by several of our insurance companies here in our marketplace. They provide entrepreneurs some seed capital money, and then they help mentor those entrepreneurs through a 100-day program where they're trying to develop some of those software solutions and other types of things to help serve the insurance industry. And we've connected those two programs. And so when the Global Insurance Accelerator completes its 100-day program, we have that time so that all of the entrepreneurs who are involved in that give presentations at the Global Insurance Symposium to a global audience. And that helps them pitch their new products or new ideas to a global audience in their industry. So we've had tremendous success with both of those initiatives. And then kind of going back on the agriculture side, we are currently, we just announced that we are going to be launching an agriculture accelerator that's going to be more based on precision agriculture. So that'll be coming up here within the next year that we'll get that launched. In terms of takeaways that we had in going through this process, which I just want to say, Brookings was absolutely fantastic to work with as we went through the creation of both of our strategies. They really pushed us to really think deeply about what can we really do as a smaller city that doesn't have some of the amenities that you would think of that a global city has. And I think ultimately what it was is just to really focus hard on the things that we are really, really good at. So that's where you've seen us elevate our efforts in ag bioscience and insurance financial services, doing some different things on a more global front in those areas. And then certainly planning our future activities to have that global aspect to those as well. And I think one of the other big things that we certainly knew domestically, but it became even more apparent is the war for talent and how important that is, not just here domestically to firms, but the international firms, I think even more so. You have to demonstrate that you have the talent in your marketplace. You have to cultivate that. You have to develop that in order to work in these jobs. As Merrick pointed out, these are much higher quality jobs, advanced jobs that global firms tend to have. And so we are actively working on those issues as well. And actually, we just released an international talent strategy here a couple of months ago to kind of help us address some of those issues.
Great. That's awesome, Ryan. Yeah, Scarborough's been very thankful to work with both Ivory and Ryan and with the local communities in Kansas City and Des Moines. And I want to applaud both of you for every strategy that you guys have put together and all of your hard work. I know that there are a lot of companies that have benefited from that. And I know that, we're eager to learn more about that. And we have lots of questions coming. Let's hear from Ivory and hear what your takeaways are and why Kansas City applied.
Sure. So our story in Kansas City is a little bit different from Des Moines, but we do have a lot of shared industries and things like that, being both amazing Midwestern cities. But for Kansas City, we had a few economic issues that we were addressing on a local level. Kansas City has had decreased productivity, decreased wages. Our economy had lost market share to the overall contribution to GDP in the United States. Our employment levels had not completely reached pre-recession levels. And exports as share of GDP for Kansas City was 2 percentage points behind, and they still are now, even that gap is behind a little bit more of the national average. So essentially Kansas City, had a lot of things going on, and that's really because of several issues. Two of our largest industries have had a lot of technological advances. So printing being one, obviously digital media is such a bigger piece of the economy now. And then also with telecom, there's been a lot of changes within that industry as well. So we saw a lot of that over the last 20 years really change for us. And so working in partnership with Brookings and really being a part of this Global Cities Initiative really helped us reflect more on some of the issues that are affecting us on a local level, and then also prepare for the future of how we can become more competitive and gain some ground in some of those areas. So what we decided is, we really wanted to take a really tangible, tactical role as it pertains to the businesses in our community on how we can help them export. And Kansas City is unique in that we straddle a state line, so we have, a few counties in Missouri and then several in Kansas, where, whenever you're dealing with two different state governments in your one region, it really took a lot of collaboration and communication on us finding, common ground and how we're going to make things better for, the businesses and ultimately the talent within our communities. Kansas City actually currently has a lot of positive things going on, despite some of these economic larger indicators. We do have net migration, and we do have a younger median age of those who are employed. So we do have some strengths there, and we also in the logistics and transportation industry, as you guys know. So we have infrastructure to get product out. We have folks here who are interested in being employed in the warehousing and distribution sector. But we need companies to be more engaged and more globally fluent on a day-to-day level of how they can have that confidence to move forward and engage an international customer. So the ultimate question is like, okay, well, who are these companies? Where are they? Where are they located? How do we get connected with them? How can we help them feel more confident about their activity as they consider international? Because ultimately, business, it's risk adverse. You want to make sure that, and even in the Midwest, and I'm sure Ryan, maybe you encountered this a little bit with your interviews that you had with companies in Des Moines, but it's the whole like don't lose the farm mentality. They don't want to. A lot of companies were just like, international, that just seems so, out there. But from everything that we do, the cars we drive, the gasoline we put in our car, the phones we're using, there has been a global influence. And so it's really how do we get companies to feel more confident? And so what we decided is, and what we learned from Kansas City's through our interviews and things like that, is that Kansas City companies just really aren't really thinking about international. And if they were thinking about international, they didn't know like who to go to and where to get started. So it kind of goes back to the slide that Merrick showed earlier about what basically the common themes are for a lot of metro economies. And so we decided that we needed to find these, at a minimum, 100 companies in Kansas City that are interested in international and connect them to the export assistance providers in Kansas City. And so what we were able to do is create something called the Export Concierge. Here's a brochure that we have. And our local economic development agencies, they're able to take this on their BRE calls, like Ryan mentioned in Des Moines, and they're able to promote the program that we have created in Kansas City at the World Trade Center, where it's just the first entry point for a company to have an introduction to an export assistance provider in our region. Like I mentioned, we are a bi-state region, so we have to be pretty honest and open about, okay, if you're a Missouri-based company, if you're a Kansas-based company, these are the resources that are available to you in your respective community. So, so we connect them to the resources. If they're new to export, how do they get that training to kind of gain on the information curve of how they can learn more about how to get started exporting. And then there's companies who are new to market. And so we set out with this goal in our export plan to have 100 companies, referred to export assistance providers. We announced our plan in April of this year. We are already working with 40 companies. Half of them are new to market and half of them are new to export. So that means, and getting really to the theme of this webinar is, those new to export companies, we are getting them linked up with the different resources in Kansas and in Missouri, depending on obviously where they're located, with getting an export business plan prepared. Because, you know, like a city, which is so different from a business, yet we still have, you know, those strengths and those weaknesses that we need to be, you know, real and need to address. You know, we need a plan for the future. And so we help these businesses, get them involved, and refer to clients to a provider who can help them create a business plan specific to them and their needs and how they can go international. And the same thing with us, with this export business plan in Kansas City. You know, it's really helping Kansas City, you know, become more globally engaged, and everyone benefits. And in fact, yesterday, I would say that one of the largest takeaways we were able to have is I met with a bank here in town that, you know, is really kind of becoming more involved with what we're doing. And they're excited because, you know, they provide only banking services. But, you know, they come into contact with businesses that have interests in accounting and, you know, freight forwarding and taxes and things like that, where they're like, we don't provide that service. How do we get companies that we're working with to know more about those sorts of issues? Can we refer them to you for that service? I'm like, absolutely. So it's really, we become not only a provider at the World Trade Center to our economic development agencies and those on a government level who are influencing economic development, but then those who are in our community that are already providing business services to also feel confident in referring clients to us, that we can help them in whatever area they may also have as an area of need. So we didn't realize that it was really going to take off. We're only working at this point with 4 economic development agencies in our community. We have a total of 18. So the 14 other economic development agencies will come on board in January. So we think the floodgates will open, and at which point we don't want the bandwidth of our organization to really get stressed out. But, you know, we are so excited to see that there's so much interest, and that really we're able to influence some folks and feeling more confident in going into this area. So many thanks to Brookings and all the wonderful work you guys and your team has given us. And it's so great to hear also the similarities between our communities in Des Moines and Kansas City, you know, being only 3.5 hours away from each other. So thank you so much for allowing us to talk here today. I guess we have some questions possibly.
Yeah. So I do want to point out that about 75% of the companies that are on this call are already exporting. So I don't know whether or not that's 1 to 10 a year, or if they're looking at expanding their markets. But obviously you guys now know that you guys can easily contact Ivory or Ryan, and they can help you move forward with an export plan if you're looking to get into a new market. So let's move into the questions. We've got a question here. It says, my company had been exporting at least for more than 30 years to many countries. Is there an updated list of what countries USA does not have any treaty with, or we are not allowed to export? And Elizabeth, that is a good question. Yes, there is an updated list. That is something that Scarborough can easily provide to you. And I would be happy to send that to you as soon as we get off this call. So obviously with that sort of question, that's in regards to exporting when it comes to like regulations and freight forwarding. That's where you would contact your freight forwarder. And again, that's where Scarborough would come into play to help you out. Let's go on to the next question. What are some of the wins? This question would be for Ivory or Ryan. What are some of the wins you guys have encountered since launching the plan? Maybe you guys can come up with an instance or an example of one that has really touched you, or you know, has helped you guys learn something throughout the process. Ryan, do you want to go first, or do you want me to answer?
Sure. I mentioned several of ours earlier just from an initiative standpoint, but one that really hit home with me, I think it was in the early stages of our export plan when we were doing our company interviews, and a firm here in our market indicated during the interview that they were literally just turning away sales opportunities from overseas because they just had absolutely no idea where to start. They had no idea who the potential partner organizations were that could provide assistance to them, how that would work, anything of that nature. and I believe, so of course, going through that process, we connected them with all the proper channels here locally. And I believe they're in 5 or 6 different countries now, and that's just happened over the last 3 years or so. And they're a great example of a global firm now that everybody kind of thinks about in our market, where before they just literally weren't even going to take the time to look at it. It's kind of a normal thing that you see with SMEs sometimes, is they're so short-staffed. They just have a finite amount of people that can do a finite amount of work. And it just goes to show how important it is to really make those connections for them as part of that BRE process or that interview process.
I would say we have several wins also in Kansas City. I would say that, you know, we hear quite often how companies are like, wow, that was so easy. You know, you guys were able to get us an answer really quickly, or to make an introduction really quickly for them, that where they had been basically hitting their head against a brick wall for about like a year or something, you know, or they weren't really sure where to go and who to talk to specifically within a company that maybe would provide that service that they need. We have made several freight forwarding referrals to great companies here in Kansas City that you know, provide that service. Same thing with accounting and tax services. So, and even legal help with a lot of contract law that companies are a little skittish about as they're looking forward to working with a client internationally. So I think the largest trade win, I guess you could say, is just that the process is so easy for the client, which is what was our main goal, you know, that they can, they don't have to get hung up on, you know, the details, and it's just such an easy process for them to get connected to the company that has the expertise, or even the resource provider, whether that be a government entity as well, where they can get a vetted, you know, list of trade needs and things like that if they're looking to export into another market. So I could say that, you know, 6 months in, that's where we are.
That's great. Yeah, you guys both made a really good point. And something I picked up on was you guys make it easy. And I think that a lot of times companies are scared because they think global, no way am I touching that. But yeah, that's right. You guys have made this very easy. Global trade management, international shipping companies like Scarborough, that's what we're here for, is to make that step and take care of those things for our communities. All right, let's go on to the next question. How do we know if we are ready to export? Is there any sort of checklist for becoming ready to export, and how would we know if we're ready to move forward?
So I know in our area, the local small business development and technology centers, they have an export readiness checklist that companies can go through, and they can check off and say, you know, this is these are the best practices if your company is looking to go international. And so basically through the SBDCs, whenever a company is new to export, so 20 of the clients that we've been working with, when we determine, yes, through our assessment, if they're ready to export, we then refer them to the SBDC, they get their training, and then they go through that checklist. And I don't know if they do anything, if you guys do anything different in Des Moines, Ryan, but really that's what we do here. I asked, one of my first questions is like, well, has an export client already contacted you? If that's the case, then obviously they might be, they might have an export ready product. And then it's just about the company making sure they have the right price point, making sure they're working with the right freight forwarder, making sure they, you know, have the right financial documents, if they need a letter of credit, you know, that kind of thing as it relates to exporting itself. Does Brookings have any recommendations for a company if they're to know if they're ready to export or not? I've never asked you guys that question.
That's a great, well, I'll let Ryan answer first about how Des Moines approaches that question.
Yeah, ours is very, very similar to what you're doing, Ivory. We pass them along to the proper channel or the proper partner. They go through that very easily. It's no fee or no charge to them to do, and it's very seamless. So it's been very effective.
So from our perspective, there are a couple of characteristics, obvious characteristics. And Ivory, you mentioned one of them, which is just, do you have a tradable good or service? and then move from that point in terms of what's your capacity for growth, where the appropriate markets might be. But that's an evaluation that you do with someone who, like yourselves or your network, can sit down and craft a business plan, an international business plan, or an evaluation first with that individual firm. So they can obviously go to lots of different support providers. One of the interesting things that we see in the case of Kansas City and Des Moines and others is the integration of the support systems and the navigation, the concierge model, the navigation of the different support providers, because so many firms find that these are fragmented systems, that they'll go in one place and then be referred to another, or they can't get what they want, and that provider is not certain or not incentivized to refer them to someone else who could be more helpful. So that strategy of integrating these kinds of assessments and support providers is very common in all of the markets that we're working with. I think the other interesting part of this, though, is how to be more proactive about reaching firms rather than a firm saying, hey, I'm thinking about exporting, where do I start? And we've seen that in a number of different markets that focus in on where they think there are export-ready industries or clusters of firms that they can reach through associations or through their ongoing BRE relationships. They know they have a cluster strength, and then they go to those firms in that sector and try to gin up the interest and target supports to them and a link to an international marketplace. So it's working through some of the sectoral trade organizations that, and as Ryan mentioned, focusing in on where you really know you have strengths and market potential for firms that are in that mid-size or some smaller category that wouldn't necessarily be thinking about exporting first, then reach them and go through this process using that aggregation technique of industries that you think make a lot of sense for international trade.
Okay, yeah, Merrick, I think that's a good segue into our next question. How do I find a client overseas? So I don't know who wants to touch on that, or if there's any type of research that Brookings done. How would our company, if I was a new exporter, find the clients that I want to target?
So there's several different methods to approaching a new client overseas. It depends on what kind of product you have. If you are so if a company is already in the United States, let's say distributing their product through a distributorship model in the United States, then it would stand to reason that they probably need to have an international distribution partner that is located in that market that would help them get their product to market. So there's several products out there. We have a listing of international distributors that we have. We have a database that has access at the World Trade Center to a lot of the different international distributor partners by market within specific industries. That's a new product that we've brought online at the World Trade Center. And then also the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service is obviously a great route to go through on this level. You know, they have something called the Gold Key Service, and that ranges in price where they're able to have vetted trade leads available for a company. It starts off at about $800 and scales up to about $1,800, depending on what the specifics are with that company and what they'd like to do. They want to just have the trade lead contact list, and then they interact with the client and figure out and vet them if that's who they want to partner with in that market, or they actually can go travel there, and then the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service will actually set up those appointments for them in that market. So there's you know, a few different methods there. And then also the state of Missouri has a program called the GMAP, which is a market access program that also they have a network of international offices. The state of Missouri does. They're actually in 12 different markets now, where they can help Missouri business get into those markets. So they have them in China, Brazil, Singapore, Israel, Mexico, Canada, you know, what have you. So those are some of the tools we utilize as we help companies find a new export client.
Some great resources. Ryan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, we do a lot of the same things. One additional asset that we have that's really nice, we're a nice close-knit kind of smaller community here. Our district export council is always willing to step up and help firms, particularly if they've worked in a given country or in a similar industry or those different types of things. So and all the things I already mentioned are things we utilize as well with commercial service. Our state economic development agency has offices in other countries, et cetera. So pretty similar.
I think that's critical to say. There are existing relationships. If you're part of a supply chain working with local firms, there are exporting firms that might be multinational or larger with which you already interact if you're doing business to business, which is a great entry point. Other is that don't start looking at the really sexy, complicated markets first. We have a trading relationship with Canada and Mexico. Those are very large markets, and they are easy to deal with. There are other examples of free trade agreement relationships to build upon as well. So the first issue is, where is it relatively straightforward to go? And are there market opportunities that you can target there through either connections of economic development, your economic development support system, your existing customer base? There are lots of different ways to look at it, but I think that the key issue is, don't make it too complicated if you're just starting. Look at the markets where it's easier to relate to and where there are fewer barriers first.
Okay. We've got a lot of other questions. I don't know that we'll be able to get to every question we have today, but I do want to let everybody know that this is recorded. We will be posting this out on our YouTube channel, so I encourage everybody to go out and subscribe. We do post all of our webinars out there. We cut them up in small snippets, so that way if you're just searching for one question, you don't have to watch an entire hour. You can just focus on that question and answer. I will send out an email with the links, as well as some of the resources that everyone has mentioned today. I'm hoping that we can maybe get some of those checklists out to people, some other links that might be helpful. Some other questions that we have that you guys may be able to answer. This is to one of our partners in Mexico, actually. So this could go both ways, I guess. What is the easiest commodity to export? And I think that this might come out of what industries are located in certain communities. So I don't know who wants to take this one on. Or maybe based on the research that Brookings has done in regards to top industries in different areas.
Well, in Kansas City, motor vehicles is our #1 export. So that might be the easiest for Kansas City to export. And then second is motor vehicle parts. And then we also have a few other industries that kind of run neck and neck every year, with architecture and engineering services, IT royalties, and then obviously logistics and freight forwarding is a huge asset to us as it relates to export. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's anything that's the easiest to export. There's regulation that varies by market to market. And then, commodities, obviously, if you're talking bulk, there's a lot of influences that are outside of, just the product itself as it relates to different market. Working in agriculture, international ag, before I started doing this job, really helped me learn a lot about the regulation in Canada versus the regulation in Mexico and Brazil, so it varies. And then not to mention that regulation can change so quickly. So
yeah, you touched on a good point there. It may not be based on commodity, more so maybe the country that you're exporting to. Brazil being probably one of the toughest countries to export to. But with that being said, we export to that country every day. It's not a problem. That's why you use freight forwarders that have the compliance and regulation backgrounds like we do. Mexico's regulations change on a daily basis. So those are things that obviously we stay up, up to date on. Ryan, do you want to add to maybe some industry sectors in your area?
Excuse me. I would agree with what you said. We actually do the Certificate of Origin program here at the Greater Des Moines Partnership. And it really, from what we do, it is more country-based. Some countries are fairly straightforward. Others drive our staff nuts in terms of trying to get all the documentation correct and some of those different types of things. And it does change frequently in some cases. So it's not so much what you're exporting, it's where it's going, I think, is probably the key to that.
Merrick, do you have anything else to add?
No, that just goes back to my point from the previous question about trying to find places that are relatively simple. And there are certainly industries or products that are more complicated and difficult to export, say, that are highly regulated, like in pharmaceuticals, like in certain kinds of defense-related industry products. So there's that overlay as well. But I think you can't say this is an easy product or service to export. It just depends upon the place, as everyone has already mentioned.
All right, terrific. Yeah, I think that today was a successful webinar. We answered a lot of questions. We do still have some questions out there, so I will be sure to get those answered and send out with the webinar links and all the resources for everyone. And I appreciate all of our presenters today. Thank you guys so much for speaking with us, and I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.